Hello, my name is Pam Seifert, and I'd like to welcome you to Remen Wholesale's 6th webinar in their TRID series. I've already been asked for a copy of this presentation. I'm happy to let everyone know that a copy along with the recorded version will be sent to all participants by Remen Wholesale after the webinar has finished. At any time during this presentation, please feel free to ask any question in the question box on the webinar panel. We will be having a short Q&A with our expert after the presentation is over. Before we begin, we're going to ask some poll questions. So I would like at this time to launch my first poll question, which is, we want to know who's with us today. Are you a broker, a lender, attorney, settlement agent, or other? And we're just going to give this just a moment or two. I have 71% of the people voted. If I can get just a couple more people, I'm going to close this out in another 3 seconds. Great. Thank you so much. So I'm closing out this poll, and I would like to ask my second poll question, which is, how many TRID webinars or seminars have you attended? And we're asking 10 plus, and you're still learning, 5 to 9, and there's so much to learn, so little time, 2 to 4, so you're just taking it all in now, or is today your very first TRID webinar? And I'll share this poll with you. We have a split vote here. Just giving it a couple more seconds. And let me close this out. And I'm going to share with everyone. So take a look at this. We have 26% of the people have gone to at least 10 or more TRID webinars. 5 to 9, we have 33%. 27% of you have been to 2 to 4 webinar or seminars. And 15%, it's your first TRID webinar today, so welcome. So if you have missed any of the webinars, you can always visit www.remenwholesale.com. Like I mentioned, this is our 6th webinar. If you'd like to see the other webinars that we've given in the past on TRID, just click on your resources bar in the blue menu bar and click webinars, and you will find them all there. So at this time, I would like to introduce Director of National Sales, Carl Markman. Carl?
Thank you very much, Pam, and thank you very much for everyone attending today. Over the last several months, we've witnessed several webinars being given by many companies across the country, and it seems that ours are always very well attended. It's also interesting to see that 2/3 of you on the call today have attended many of these webinars over the last several months, and some of you, approximately 1/3, this is either your first or you've only been on a couple of these webinars. We're only a little over 2 months away, so it's very, very important that you understand all the changes that will be taking place, and that's why we're lucky enough to have our Chief Compliance Officer, Phil Schild, to present today. So without further ado, I'm going to release this to Phil.
Thanks, Carl, and good afternoon, everybody. Before we get into the presentation, specifics, I wanted to mention that I did not know when we scheduled this that today was going to be the CFPB's birthday. But it turns out that the CFPB is actually 4 years old today. There is an official announcement that they posted. And I think that as we set up our presentation talking about TRID, I think it's important to kind of just look at things from the perspective of the CFPB today, because pretty much everything that we're talking about in TRID has the CFPB stamp on it. So the CFPB announcement says, for us, that's 4 years of protecting you, meaning consumers, by creating new consumer protections for financial products and services, holding bad actors accountable, listening and learning from your experiences and complaints, and developing useful tools and resources to empower you to make informed financial decisions. That's the perspective that the Bureau is pointing to consumers. And their accomplishments that they're highlighting here: in the past 4 years, we've secured $10.8 billion in relief for millions of harmed consumers. We received more than 650,000 complaints and work to help you get responses from companies. And we've created tools and resources like owning a home, paying for college, and asked CFPB to help you plan for your financial future. What the announcement doesn't say is that we've helped mortgage brokers and wholesale lenders stay in business. And that's the point where we can smile for a second and say the Bureau is about protecting consumers. And there's very little that you'll see here or hear about today in reality that is about making our lives easier. So since this is the business that we are doing, we have chosen it. We're going to just continue with our path of trying to educate our business partners and to hopefully allow you to navigate these challenging times with us as your primary resource. So getting into this, actually today it became official, what we're displaying now, that TRID was pushed back to October 3rd. That had to go through some formal rulemaking for that October 3rd date to be official, but that also came out today on the Bureau's birthday, so wow, a double whammy. So there was an administrative error that caused this change, and really at the end of it, we believe that the pressure from Congress, the pressure from industry participants, technology companies, is really what pushed the Bureau to extend this 60 days. I think everybody involved is going to use every last bit of that 60 days because I think we need it. And I can say that we were diligently preparing for August 1st and definitely took a nice breather and a sigh of relief that we got the additional 60 days. As Pam mentioned, we've been doing webinars now for Remen Wholesale since February. And we've been meticulous in how we've approached it, not trying to put out too much information at once. And the goal of today's webinar is to go back through some of these things, to rehash some of it, some updates where necessary. You'll notice some of the slides do still have August 1st as the date because we are either quoting directly other materials from the Bureau or from other sources. And also mentioning here that there are a number of questions that are being asked during this webinar, meaning I am asking questions to you, things that you need to think about. And I'm not necessarily providing answers because we don't have all of your answers, but we think it was very important at this stage in the process for you to be really looking at your processes, evaluating things with your LOS, with your staff, with your training, and so forth. So that's really what the goal really of this webinar is for today. So once again, as a reminder, TRID only applies to closed-end consumer credit transactions secured by real property. Okay, the rule does not apply to HELOCs, reverse mortgages, mobiles, or dwellings that are not attached to land, limited scope creditors who only make 5 or fewer loans a year, and certain other types of mortgages. At this point, we would hope that you know your product mix and you know whether or not you're originating product that is only covered by TRID or whether or not you're going to be continuing based on your product mix to originate loans that will require GFEs and TILs in one tract, and then the other tract being those that will require your loan estimates and your closing disclosures. Also hoping at this point that those terms, loan estimate and closing disclosure, and their abbreviations, LE and CD, have become comfortable for you in understanding those new terms. We're going to talk about some helpful hints along the way today, preparing today, and things to think about today. So we're just starting off with some very basics. It's not necessarily chronological in the life of a loan, but some of it will naturally flow. Well, defining an application is not the first thing in the process when you're speaking to a potential borrower. Thinking about application definition today is an important thing, and as we've mentioned previously, new definition of application, 6 items. The 7th catch-all item that a lender or creditor could pick is no longer part of the definition starting in October. Remembering that applications received on October 1st and earlier, old disclosures, GFEs and TILs, closing on HUD-1s with final TILs. Applications on or after October 3rd, new disclosure requirements. Loan estimates up front, closing disclosures at closing. Some of the items that we think that you should be considering at this point, and this is a consistent theme for this presentation. Items that you should consider, not necessarily going to have the answers for you, but definitely where we have some guidance, we will provide it. How will your loan origination system track the 6 items? That definition of an application. Is it something that will trigger a stop in your system or an alert in your system to notify your processor or your MLO that, hey, we have 6 items. Even if we didn't want 6 items, if we have those 6 pieces of information verbally on a web app, whatever it happens to be, we have triggered the requirement for an early disclosure, a loan estimate. Other workflow considerations, if you take applications online, inquiries online, just basic informational requests online. How will your online system need to be updated, if it does at all? Are you requesting 6 pieces of information that will be triggering early disclosure requirements that today you don't trigger those, but you will starting October 3rd, and therefore you have to decide, do I want to disclose early? Do I want to issue LEs on those, or do I want to not ask to sequence information? You don't have to ask, for 6 pieces of information. Logical things for purchase people are, we're not going to ask maybe for the subject property address up front, so we don't have that 6th item, and therefore we're not triggering the LE requirement. The other item here mentioned is not so much about origination, but it's also about the life of a transaction. You will have loans in your pipeline, that will be going down one of the 2 paths for as long as it takes for your existing RESPA TILA pipeline to close out. And who's going to be communicating that? How are you going to know if it's old versus new? Am I dealing with GFEs and TILs as loans have to be redisclosed through the process and then ultimately HUD-1s, or am I dealing with LEs or CDs? And then ultimately also, how will the settlement agent know? Some other items in the pre-application environment to think about. One are closing costs and fee worksheets, something that people have been using for a long time. What we found in 2010 with the RESPA changes and when the GFE got redesigned, that the GFE wasn't necessarily a great tool for people to understand all their fees. So people use these closing costs or fee worksheets and so forth that were modeled on the old pre-2010 GFE. And when that happened, people got used to that, and they're used to using that today. Now, coming forward into TRID, there are some requirements if you're going to use that. You're allowed to use a closing cost worksheet, but there are certain information required. There's a specific disclaimer so that the borrower knows that this is not an official loan estimate, that it's just a worksheet. And the form has to look visually different than a loan estimate so that the borrower is not to be confused by that. So we have some considerations for this. Will your loan origination system have a template that is compliant, that meets these requirements that the Bureau has put out? And can you customize it? Can you put your MLO's information on it, your logo, maybe the picture if that's something you use, an MLS ID and so forth, so that the other requirements that you have when it comes to displaying licensing information, if this happens to be considered an advertisement, are also being covered there. If not, how are you going to handle that? Do you allow your MLOs to use custom versions of these things, or is it one uniform template that the entire company uses? And are they local? Meaning do they have them in their laptop or something like that that you can't control, but you want to be able to control going forward because of the fact that TRID imposes some specific requirements on these closing cost worksheets. And the last mentioning item here, as I said before, you may have, depending on your product mix, products that are not covered by TRID. Does the template that you're going to use for your closing cost worksheet apply to both? Does it allow you to market those products that are non-TRID today, and then also those products that are covered under TRID going forward? Once again, these are questions that each individual company is going to have to answer and figure out for themselves. And some of the answers will come from your lenders, some of them will come from LOS, and some of these things are policy decisions that you're going to need to make on your own as you get through the stuff. Another idea that it has to be dealt with is the idea of existing leads. Okay, so the question here, I'm not going to read all the text of this, but which rule applies if the 6 application items are already in the file on August 1st, but the GFE and TIL have not been issued because the application was not complete under the existing definition? Okay, now obviously the first thing is that this now applies to October 3rd, and everything in this, obviously with their references, have to be updated based on the new dates. So the idea is here, if you have an application today that you have the 6 items, but today we have a 7-item application definition. So today that doesn't trigger requirements for disclosure. What happens on October 3rd with that same prospect or that lead where you have 6 items? And if the rule basically says that that does not trigger a TRID disclosure at that point, which means that that file exists under the existing definition of an application, and therefore that loan will carry its way through as an existing RESPA TILA application, not a TRID application. So the considerations we have here are, what control do you have over defining old versus new, meaning old application versus new within your LOS? There are many companies that have considered changing the definition of an application today and disclose leads now under RESPA TILA, which means that instead of using the 7-item application definition, just make it the 6 today, which means that when you trigger 6, you would issue your GFE and the TILA would be issued today based on the 6-item application. That is a way to consider transitioning the pipeline so that you don't have to start suddenly thinking on October 2nd, what am I going to do about definition of application? Or how are, to my point, lenders going to be handling this? You know, what are they going to be doing when they look at your submissions to make sure that you didn't trigger an application definition, an early disclosure definition requirement and so forth. So once again, those are questions that need to be addressed, and you need to think about how your system can help you support that information and keeping track of these differences. One of the topics that got a lot of press in the last couple of months was pre-qualifications and pre-approvals, and what did TRID do to that? And some of the quotes here, which I'll just read for the benefit, is that the Bureau does not believe that the definition of application will restrict creditors' ability to provide pre-qualification cost estimates or grant pre-approvals. That was their position on that. Okay, and if you look further, it says that specifically the Bureau believes that there is little need for creditors to gather specific information about the loan transaction, such as the property address or loan amount sought, to make pre-qualification estimates and so forth. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. And I think that every day of the week today, MLOs are gathering this information, and maybe they're not issuing a property-specific pre-qualification, but if the region demands a pre-approval or the marketplace demands a pre-approval, that you have people that want to see a document from a lender with the property address on it. And this is one of those areas that people are going to still have to figure out, what are we going to be doing? And, to the point here, the term creditor is used throughout the rules, but this applies to a broker as well when they're operating and doing these types of things. So this to us raises a number of questions. What changes need to be made to your forms for pre-qualifications and pre-approvals? Are you going to limit your pre-qualifications to the generic items? You can qualify for XYZ amount, and you're not going to ever have a property address listed. If you're going to do a pre-approval with a property address, the other 5 items you need in order to actually determine if somebody qualifies. So the question then becomes, are you going to then trigger the requirement for loan estimate at that point? And if so, that's okay. But the point is that you have to think about it. Are you really prepared to issue a loan estimate at the point that you're issuing a pre-approval, if that's what you want to do? Okay. The other question is, what will you do if the borrower volunteers to provide information? And the relevancy of that is that you can't require verification of information once you have the 6 items. You have to issue the LE. But borrowers can, volunteer that information. And are you going to accept that information? And if so, what are you going to do with that information? How's that going to impact your process? The next item, what impact does the application definition have on your LOS folder and pipeline management functions? What you do today operationally, where you define when an application moves in your LOS system. When it's a prospect, and the MLO has unfettered access to it. They can make changes. They can do pre-qualification runs. They can run credit and do all these other things. And then what happens when you have those 6 items, and now that's going to basically require a disclosure. Who's going to be responsible for issuing that loan estimate? How does that interact with your various lender requirements when it comes to that, and so forth? So we do not have all the answers to these things, but these are the things that, once again, you should be thinking about. Last bullet, if your practice today is to issue a property-specific pre-anything, so pre-qual, pre-approval, whatever you want to call it, without the file being deemed an application and being disclosed, this will likely become a thing of the past, because you can't have it both ways. If you have 6 items, or if you have 5 items and you're required to get that 6th item because that seller on a property or that builder wants a property address specific document, whether it be a pre-qual or a pre-approval, and you've got to run credit and you know how much the borrower wants and so forth, well then once again, you may be at that point triggering the requirement to issue a loan estimate. Can't answer that for you, but it's something to definitely think about, and to also know what your market dictates as far as what are sellers and builders and so forth requiring on your purchase transactions. Going to move a little bit into the loan estimate and just some ideas about compensation that that impact, once again, workflow and are things that we need to think about. Okay, as we've said in the prior webinars, only borrower-paid compensation appears on the loan estimate. Okay, lender-paid compensation, what used to be called yield spread premium, when the definitions changed in 2010, lender-paid compensation, LPC, is not listed on the LE. It can't be listed on the LE. Okay? Many think that's a great thing. You know, that's a great thing because now brokers are evenly matched against banks and bankers and so forth who didn't have to disclose their, you know, their back-end points or whatever you want to call it, gain on sale and so forth. So that's a good thing. But there is a challenge here, is that you still have to comply with Dodd-Frank rules about compensation, about, in the wholesale context, having a bucket, you know, a lender-paid bucket. And how, you know, are you going to verify that you priced your loan correctly? You know, you don't have a GFE. Today you have a GFE to look at your origination charge and your credit for interest rate chosen. You can see whether or not your MLO priced the loan correctly. You know, depending on how you push out pricing in your shop and depending on how your, you know, what access your MLOs have, this is something to think about. You know, once again, all we can do is tell you is that, you know, we're going to require that when a file comes in as part of the certification that is given now, either on the cover sheet or on the certification that's required now, we're going to require you to state what your, you know, what the bucket is, what your expectation is for what your pricing is, and we're going to match it up against what we're tracking for your bucket, so that we know up front that you've, you know, that you structured the loan as best as we can tell the way you want it to. So it's an important item that gets lost in the shuffle. You know, the emphasis was great. You don't have to disclose this. It's disclosed on the closing disclosure, so it comes up there. But do we really want to wait till the very end of the transaction when we're preparing a closing disclosure to make sure that a loan was actually set up and priced properly? So I think that's a little known thing. I haven't seen many people talk about that. It did come, you know, we raised the question, and basically the determination was is that, you know, you've got to be able to track this some other way. You know, not within obviously disclosure because it doesn't exist here. And here, as you can see, the section of loan estimate that deals with it, origination charges, now that first block, which is the percentage of loan amount or the points, is specifically reserved for that, okay? And there's no place to put lender-paid compensation, okay? Fees paid directly by the borrower get listed here. That would include broker fee, and you can see the other types of fees, you know, but that percentage block is specifically for points that are used to reduce the interest rate. And that's the only place that you can actually disclose a percentage of the loan amount as a fee. And here, going along with this is just the rest of the story, which is that we can see on the loan estimate up front, we do not have lender-paid compensation, but there it appears. And once again, on the closing disclosure, you know, this was put in as, you know, a broker fee that's being paid by others, in this particular case, a lender. Noting here is that we have not seen a single CFPB example form with the LPC. All the ones that you'll see on these webinars like ours is where we take the form and we put it in. And that's what we expect it to look like. That's what we expect, you know, LOS to put it out as. But once again, how does your LOS track your comp? How does that manifest itself? How that gets communicated to your lender, and how that ultimately makes it out to the CD. And that's what this is all about, this entire slide. Some other considerations that, depending on your shop, may or may not be impacted by this at the application stage, okay? Once again, TRID did not alter the definition of application under the other main rules, HMDA and ECOA, okay? TRID, once again, defined application, 6 items for the very specific purpose of having to issue the loan estimate, okay? But when it comes to the other requirements, you know, in this particular case, HMDA Reg C and ECOA Reg B, you know, as mentioned here, the definition of application doesn't alter those things, okay? And just quoting from the slide, the Bureau recognizes the potential benefits of a single definition of application, including reduced regulatory burden. However, the definition of application in this final rule determines when consumers must be given disclosures that enable them to shop for and compare different loan and settlement cost options, period. It doesn't have to do with making a credit decision or HMDA reportability and so forth. And our next slide talks about that as well. Okay, the definition of application in this final rule serves a different purpose than the definition of application in Reg B and Reg C. Okay? Application as defined by this final rule triggers a creditor's obligation to provide disclosures to aid consumers in shopping and so forth. And then on the other hand, the creditor's receipt of an application under Reg B triggers a creditor's duty to make a credit decision and notify the borrower within a specified time frame, and the rest obviously being HMDA. And the point being here is that, once again, how is LOS treating this? How is the loan origination distinguishing between a TRID application versus an ECOA application versus a HMDA application? Is it not? What do you have to do to keep track of things, depending on whether or not you're funding your loans potentially? You know, what are your HMDA requirements? If you have in-house delegated, you know, if you have an in-house underwriter for certain products that you do, you know, how is that impacting your ECOA requirements and so forth? and just the blanket goal of considering pipeline management and reporting implications. Important stuff there. Wanted to mention here, at this time, last year, we were into QM, and a lot of thoughts were about QM and so forth. So, TRID disclosures do not document compliance with QM points and fees tests. When 2 screens ago or 3 screens ago, when I showed the origination section talking about points, it's not QM points. Okay, it's not that requirement to make sure that you don't exceed the 3 points, to make a loan QM eligible. So the creditor is responsible for tracking charges off sheet to ensure that the amounts disclosed in the loan estimate were made in good faith and the charges at closing do not exceed the applicable tolerances. So I said in the considerations, what does tracking off sheet mean? What does it really mean in practice? Does that mean LOS? Does that mean lender practice will vary? Does this impact transactional workflow? Similarly, the creditor is responsible for tracking finance charges and points and fees off sheet. If you look at the loan estimate, there's no indication of what's an APR fee, what's a finance charge, yes or no from that. So once again, these are things that, depending on how you operate in your shop, you're going to need to be aware of those things. Okay. Processing and underwriting considerations, kind of, once again, having our loan travel chronologically through. The TRID disclosures do not specifically address underwriting guidelines. But if you take a look at the actual disclosures, the actual forms, both the loan estimate and the closing disclosure require the information below. You have to track the down payment and the deposit, earnest money deposit. Seller credits are tracked. Funds for the borrower are tracked. Lender credits are tracked. Once again, today, those things are really not part of your GFE and your TIL, definitely not part of the TIL. And if you think about that, how does that impact processing and workflow and the accuracy of those disclosures? Okay. Pointing out here, look at the processes for how contract addendums that affect these items are handled and institute procedures for swift and specific communication to the lender. If once the file is submitted to the lender and they're now taking care of any subsequent redisclosures, if there's a contract addendum that affects earnest money deposit or the seller's credit and so forth, that has to be communicated. Okay? How do any of these impact DU and AUS findings? We know that that's an area, sticky area for DU, how earnest money is tracked in your LOS, how that transmits to DU and so forth, and the accuracy of your cash to close calculations based on how that is input and the information that you have. We mentioned here pre-closing instructions and setting the stage, something that we're going to be instituting for the parties to the transaction just to give them a little bit of the sense of what's happening here. Some of the timing requirements, the changes that we want to be able to be informed of by our brokers and so forth, so that we can make it as smooth as possible throughout that transaction. We're going to move into the closing disclosure, timing and delivery. Some of this is information that was disclosed on prior webinars, but because it is some of them, we'll call it the groundbreaking, the biggest changes that there are regarding TRID, wanted to spend just a slide or two on this again. And for the 15% of the folks who are attending your first webinar, hopefully you've already heard this, but if not, this is one of those things that you definitely need to pay attention to. Creditor is generally responsible for ensuring that the consumer or the borrower receives a closing disclosure no later than 3 specific business days before consummation. We've heard the term specific business days, all days except for Sundays and legal public holidays. Okay. Once that CD has been issued, there are only 3 instances in which a new 3-day waiting period will be applied to that. That will be if the APR becomes inaccurate, which is an increase of 1/8 for a fixed rate, or an increase of 1/8 for almost all ARM products, and 1/4 for irregular transactions. We don't offer any of those types of transactions here, but that's the biggest one, which is if you have an APR variance after the CD has been issued. Loan product changes, not going to happen too often. We don't expect that at the very end of a transaction and suddenly the loan product is going to change, but if it does after the CD has been issued, then at that point a new CD will need to be generated, and then that triggers a new 3-day waiting period. Also, if a prepayment penalty is added, and once again we don't offer them and it's not very common, we would think in practice that at the very, very end of a transaction that a prepayment penalty would also just suddenly be added. So some considerations in the world of the closing disclosure just to talk about real briefly here. First, if the closing disclosure is not provided to the consumer in person, the consumer is considered to have received it 3 business days after it is delivered or placed in the mail. Electronic delivery, in our opinion, will be the preferred method whenever possible. But the point being, what delivery mechanism is being used? You know, what is the lender doing? Who's generating and delivering that CD? What if the borrower cannot receive it electronically? What if they don't have email or internet or whatever it happens to be? How are we going to get that closing disclosure to them? Are we going to hand deliver it? Are we going to UPS it, US mail it, whatever it happens to be? Important considerations. Next being, the creditor may contract with a settlement agent to provide the closing disclosure on the creditor's behalf. However, in this case, the creditor is still legally responsible for the accuracy as well as any errors or defects. Remember, wholesale is going to be providing these CDs. We're going to be generating these CDs. You know, delivering it, we're going to deliver it. You know, whether the settlement agent will be responsible for delivering that with the broker has yet to be determined. You know, and the question is, what role will the broker play in assisting coordination and preparation for closing? You know, these are questions that will vary across different lenders and also vary across the broker. Can the CD be given to non-parties, realtors? This has been a question that's been answered many times on some of our retail webinars, and you know, it's a disclosure. You know, it's a borrower-specific disclosure, which means if somebody else wants to see it, in our opinion, the borrower has to give that person authority. You know, the realtor is not a party to that closing disclosure. At least not the borrower's closing disclosure. So once again, those are things that are going to need to be still hashed out. Last couple points on the screen with the CD, that consummation. You know, this is all about the borrower receiving 3 specific business days before consummation. Consummation is defined under Reg Z as the time that a consumer becomes contractually obligated, which is when the note is signed in most jurisdictions on a credit transaction. Okay, do any lenders vary in how this is treated? And you may see some variances across here, but generally speaking, everybody's going to refer to what the state laws are and when consummation is, which is usually, once again, when that note is signed. The last item is that the settlement agent must provide the seller with the closing disclosure. That's a requirement in the rule. You know, most lenders will then require a copy of the seller CD. So for your purchase transactions, we're going to have the borrower CD that we will have prepared, and then we're going to have the seller CD that the settlement agent will have prepared, and we will require copies of both those. Coordination of the closing. You know, this is something that we talked about a couple of webinars ago, and once again, think it's really important just because of the 3-day advance requirement for delivery of the CD, the additional triggers for additional time, and really realizing here that, you know, how we communicate today and how information is transferred and the timeliness in which it occurs, there's going to be some impact there. We can't tell you what the impact will be for you, but we do know that, you know, it's going to be a change for realtors, builders, settlement agents, escrow, everybody involved with this. You know, the manner in which information needs to flow and the timeliness is going to be different. And, you know, these are things that we've mentioned before. I'm not going to read every bullet here, but, you know, this I think is really important, and to also understand processes. You know, we are working on a system, a portal system for communication with settlement agents. You know, that is our expectation, is what we will be using in October, which will be a collaborative system for the settlement agent to upload fees, for them to also be able to upload the various invoices and bills and so forth, so that we can properly create a CD. And you hear a lot of talk about that's what's happening out there with a lot of companies, so that preparation of the CD will be a collaborative process, and almost all the work that the settlement agent is doing today, they will still be doing the same thing. They'll still be gathering invoices and termite and, you know, repairs and realtor bills and title insurance bills and all this other stuff. Tax and per diems and waters and sewer and all that, and they will be taking that information and they will be uploading it to the lender, so the lender can prepare the closing disclosure and then generate it back, deliver it to the borrower, and then obviously to the settlement agent and so forth. So these are things that, you know, these considerations about setting expectations and timeliness, early communication, pre-closing instructions, accurate estimates, and reliable vendors, all critical in this regard. Wanted to mention also here that back in June, once again the dates here are off because of when this was issued. You know, there had been some confusion in the industry. This was right after our last webinar here. There had been, well, the confusion was before that, but the CFPB posted a closing fact sheet in June 3rd, June 4th, and these are some of the excerpts from that we thought were important to once again display for you. And once again, this is geared towards the consumer. Will the new mortgage disclosures delay my closing? And the answer is no for just about everybody. You know, and then it goes into the 3 business day requirements. And then the third bullet, many things can change in the days leading up to closing. Most changes will not require the lender to give you 3 more business days to review the new terms before closing. The new rule allows for ordinary changes that do not alter the basic terms of the deal. So we went over those 3 items that trigger, okay, and we talked about that before. But when we talk about the nuance of what the statement is, the new rules allow for ordinary changes. Okay, well, ordinary changes happen every day of the week. They happen at the last minute, they happen at the table, and so forth. And I think the thing that's important is that today when that happens, the settlement agent, paralegal, whoever, goes over to their computer, makes that correction to the HUD-1, prints it out, and has everybody sign it. Hopefully at the same time they're getting the lender to approve it. That process is going to change for most cases because the settlement agent is not going to be the owner of that CD. The lender will. So I think that's an important thing here. That's a nuance that, once again, communication, last-minute changes, walkthroughs. Walkthroughs are not going to be the day of closing in many cases, because you've got to give time for these things to occur. So that stuff is also addressed here in this closing fact sheet, and we provided at the bottom of this a link to that. I'm not going to go through all the stuff here, but there are some real-life examples, and if you haven't seen this, once again, this was geared towards the consumer. But I think there's a lot of good stuff to learn from that as well. In the last couple slides here as we wrap up were some things that came out. Once again, this stuff at this point is a couple months old, so some of the date references are not necessarily applicable today, but I think it was really important. There was a flurry, a couple months ago of some industry trade shows and things like that where you were starting to hear from land title, you were starting to hear from the NAR, you were starting to hear from other participants other than just the lending community about this. So here are a couple things I just wanted to point out. At the time, some things that were coming from some of the real estate trade organizations other than the NAR, that buyers should not expect to make changes at the closing. Sellers should not do anything that require changes at closing. From application to settlement, everyone, including the realtor, needs to communicate and set realistic expectations. For example, if you want to close on, now we'll change this, November 30th, you need to pretend the closing date is actually, November 23rd. You need to be able to plan, in advance and put in additional buffers for what the expectations are for these closing dates. Here's some specific stuff from the NAR. The industry has to maintain a united front and support of one another is widespread. What is affecting one will affect all. And then it talks about here that encouraging the CFPB to consider a trial implementation period. Okay, obviously this was before the 60-day extension, but even then, once we have the October 4th date, is there going to be any sort of hold harmless section or lax enforcement period? Because all the 60 days did was to get us closer to being ready, not really addressing the fact that there's still going to be a definite period of time when people need to get used to the new rules. And the NAR went out to say that NAR really is not specifically liable for anything under TRID. So we'll see how that plays itself out as we go. Really, as we wrap up now, I'd like to pass it back over to Pam, and then we're going to do a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll send it back to Carl. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil. We did receive a lot of questions, so we're going to try to get through as many as we can in the last few minutes that we do have left. Phil, someone asked, it takes more than 6 items to provide an informed loan estimate. Can we ask for that additional information without having to require it?
You can ask for additional information, not require it, and the answer is yes. And if you think about, the information that's on the LE, the 6 items triggers the requirement. You can't verify any of those 6 items. You're allowed to ask for additional information, but you can't hold the LE hostage if you don't get it. So that's the point, and that's one of the ideas, the concepts about sequencing and about getting information, which is that are you really comfortable when you have the 6 that you are sufficiently informed enough to issue a valid LE? And that's part of the rub here, which once again everybody's going to have to figure that out to a certain extent on their own.
Great, thank you. You mentioned one of the items was the subject property address. Is that when the contract is signed or when the loan officer would know the address, even if it was verbally?
Okay, so the way it's written is that it's, once that information has been communicated to you, so there's nothing, at least to my knowledge, in the rule that says, the 6th item is triggered if we're using subject property address as the 6th item only when you have a valid binding contract. It doesn't say that. It says that once that information has been communicated to the creditor, is what the language is, then the creditor, once it has the 6 items, is required. So once again, this idea of sequencing, perhaps we don't want to know that until you have a valid contract. And I think, unfortunately here, the reality of what happens is going to be different than, what it says on paper is what should be happening.
And could you just go through what those 6 items are again?
Okay, so obviously we have the borrower's name, we have the Social Security number. Now it says Social Security number in order to, to run a credit report. I don't know why else we need the Social Security number. So we have the name, Social Security number, the income, the subject property address, the estimate of the property value, and the loan amount sought.
Great, thank you. Some of our loan officers want to know about pre-qualification. Will that still be allowed without having to disclose?
If you look back on the deck, we did spend 1 or 2 slides on that, and it really goes back to that underlying definition of application. So they're independent items, which means that 6 items is independent of pre-qualification or pre-approval. Once you have the 6 items, you need to issue the LE. If as part of your pre-qualification you have the 6 items, regardless of when you get them, once you have the 6 items, you've got 3 days to issue that loan estimate. So I think people are going to become, a little bit more specific how they deal with these things. They're going to figure out ways to navigate this so that they can effectively operate their business, whether that means they're going to be issuing more disclosures up front, or whether that means they're going to sequence information so that they're not necessarily disclosing until they're comfortable.
Great. And when it comes to knowing their income, do you need pay stubs or tax returns, or is it just once it's accurate or not, what the income would be, would you have to disclose?
It's once you have the information. There's no verification allowed, as we mentioned, prior to, you can't require verification prior to issuing the loan estimate. So really what you're talking about here is that if the borrower tells you over the phone, I make $100,000, for example, you haven't seen a pay stub, you haven't seen a W-2 or tax return. If they told you they made $100,000 and they told you the other 5 items, you have an application, you have 3 days to issue the loan estimate.
Great, thank you. If the product changes from a 5-1 to a 7-1 ARM, but the APR does not increase, does the CD still need to be redisclosed?
The answer is yes, but it's not going to trigger a new 3-day waiting period. So I just want to just take a minute and distinguish the changes here. At the end of the day, we are required to deliver the borrower an accurate CD. And that accurate CD, in some cases, may not even be generated until after closing, because sometimes, for instance, things like recording fees and other things change after the closing. And once we know that information, we're required for issuing that CD to the borrower. So in the example that you just discussed, okay, that's one where, once again, APR is not being triggered, okay, but there is an inaccuracy, meaning that the product type is, changing, and that has to be properly disclosed on the form. If the APR varies, even though it didn't go up by 1/8, you still have to reissue it. Not going to trigger a new 3-day waiting period, but you have to issue it once you become aware of it, and then that has to be provided to the borrower at the closing.
Great, thank you. We're going to ask one more question because we are running out of time, and this is one that someone hasn't asked before, so in our previous webinars. When we're talking about counting the number of days, the 3 days, and the days that your business is open, does it matter if the broker's business is open those days, or is it just the lenders?
It's a relatively complicated question, and it goes down, kind of goes back to the original slides talking about who's doing what. Okay, so lenders are going to have various mechanisms to, to accept these loan estimates, whether it be a broker prepared one, whether it be a lender prepared one, whether it be a broker prepared through a lender portal, or a system that the lender provides. So whoever's issuing that, okay, whatever entity is issuing that loan estimate, it is based on their operation. So from a practical standpoint in the wholesale world, we're not originating the loan, we're not taking the application. We don't know when the 6 items have been triggered. So it's going to be based on that broker's, general business days, which is their days of operation when they are open for business. That's going to dictate, when that loan estimate has to be issued. At least that's my sense of it today.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate your expertise, Phil. Carl, are you still with us?
I'm still here, Pam. Yes, thank you. And thank you very much, Phil. We're extremely lucky to have Phil on our side, able to explain all of this information in detail and get us ready for TRID on October 3rd. I just was sitting here during the presentation listening a lot, and I've been listening to a lot of these webinars, as many of you have as well. And in counting, we have 53 business days remaining until October 3rd hits. And if you all remember that when we thought it was going to happen on August 1st, the time crept by rather quickly. So the next 53 days will creep by very, very quickly. So it's imperative that all of you, not only on the Rem and Wholesale webinars, get on as many webinars as possible and listen to different people explain, so that way you're ready. Our world's about to change, and if you don't listen and move with the change, then change is going to surpass you. So I implore all of you to learn as much as possible about what's about to happen. This is an opportunity for all of us, so take advantage of the additional time that we have. Look forward to some emails that are going to be coming out shortly, introducing the next webinar that we're going to be offering next month and the following month after that, in order to make sure that as many people are educated as possible. Again, we thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to the next webinar next month. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.